In the summer of 1966, a woman named Delphine Ashworth stood in a narrow kitchen in Memphis, Tennessee, doing the same thing nearly every mother on her block did every single week, stretching a grocery budget that never quite matched the size of her family. 6 children, 1 paycheck, and a pantry that leaned hard on whatever came in a can or a sack that month. This was the decade canned meat took over America's shelves, when a 5 and dime could sell you an entire dinner in a tin, and black mothers across the country learned exactly which of those tins actually fed a family and which ones just filled it up with air. This is what I do. I go looking for the meals that quietly disappeared once the decade ended, the dishes built from whatever the corner store had on special that week. Before we're through, you'll hear about a canned meat spread that came wrapped in paper like a stick of butter, a soup made from nothing but a picked-over chicken carcass, and a gravy so plain it barely had a name of its own. My name is Uncle Elijah, and this is 20 cheap meals black mothers cooked in the 1960s to keep a full table on a thin budget. None of these came from a cookbook, and most of them never got written down at all. They lived in a mother's head, adjusted week to week depending on exactly what the check allowed. Starting at the bottom of the list. Number 20. Corn fritters. Fresh or canned corn mixed into a simple batter of flour, egg, and milk, then dropped by the spoonful into hot fat and fried until golden and crisp at the edges. A single can of corn, stretched with flour and egg, could turn into a dozen or more fritters, enough to cover a whole family's dinner plate alongside whatever meat, if any, happened to be on the stove that night. They came together in under 20 minutes, which mattered on the nights a mother got home from work with barely enough time to get supper on the table before everyone needed to be in bed. A little sugar worked into the batter turned them almost dessert-like, which made them just as popular served alongside syrup for breakfast as they were sitting next to a plate of greens for dinner. Number 19. Fried okra. Sliced thin, dredged in cornmeal, and fried until the outside turned deeply crisp while the inside stayed tender. Fried okra turned one of the cheapest vegetables in any southern garden into something children actually asked for seconds of. Okra grew easily and produced heavily through the hot summer months, which meant a single small garden patch could keep a family in fried okra for weeks without costing a single extra dime at the store. The trick most mothers knew by heart was keeping the oil hot enough that the coating crisped fast, since a slow fry was the difference between a crunchy side dish and a slimy one nobody wanted to eat. Number 18. Mustard greens. Sharper and more peppery than collards, mustard greens were simmered low and slow with a small piece of fatback or smoked meat until they turned deep, dark green and tender enough to cut with a spoon. They grew fast, even in a small backyard plot, and a single bunch could stretch across 2 or 3 meals once cooked down. Served with a splash of pepper vinegar and a wedge of cornbread, mustard greens filled a plate for almost nothing beyond the cost of the smoked meat used to season the pot. Some households mixed them straight in the same pot with turnip greens or collards, stretching a single smaller bunch of mustards across a much bigger, more balanced mess of greens. Number 17. Collard greens and cornbread. Milder and heartier than mustard greens, collards got the same low, slow treatment, simmered for hours until they lost every trace of bitterness and the broth underneath turned rich and dark. A single pot could feed a large family across several nights, since collards only improved as leftovers, tasting even better reheated the second or third time around. Paired with a wedge of hot cornbread for soaking up the broth, this dish represented one of the most dependable, stretchable vegetable dinners a tight budget kitchen could put together. A big enough pot, started on a Sunday, could genuinely carry a family clean through to Wednesday, reheated each night and tasting a little richer with every round. Number 16. Field peas and rice. Fresh or dried Crowder peas, simmered with a little salt pork until tender, then spooned generously over a bed of plain white rice. Field peas were cheap and filling in a way that meat could never quite match on a limited budget, and a single pound of dried peas could stretch across an entire week of dinners for a family willing to eat them again and again. Some households seasoned the pot heavier with pepper, others kept it plain, but nearly every family leaning on a tight grocery budget in the 1960s had some version of this dish in weekly rotation. Dried peas kept for months in a sack without spoiling, which meant a mother could buy a large bag on a good week and know she had at least a few dinners already covered for whatever came next. Number 15. Butter beans and ham hock. Lima beans, simmered for hours with a smoked ham hock until the beans turned creamy and the broth thickened into something rich enough to eat on its own with a spoon. A single ham hock, picked up cheap from the butcher counter, could season an entire pot large enough to feed a family for 2 or 3 nights running. It asked for almost no attention once it was on the stove, which made it a favorite for mothers working full days outside the home and needing dinner to practically cook itself. A low flame and a lid was really all it needed, which meant it could simmer through an entire afternoon while the rest of the house's chores got done around it. Now, it's worth pausing here on something that shaped this entire decade of cooking. The 1960s were the peak of America's love affair with canned and processed convenience food. Shelves full of tinned meats, powdered mixes, and boxed dinners marketed directly at busy mothers trying to stretch both time and money at once. For Black families balancing full-time jobs, growing households, and grocery budgets that never quite kept pace with the cost of living, these products weren't a luxury or a shortcut. They were often the only way a working mother could get a full dinner on the table by the time everyone made it home. Advertisers of the decade marketed almost exclusively to white suburban housewives. But Black mothers working just as hard, often with less money and less help, adopted these same products just as quickly, bending them to fit recipes that had nothing to do with what the label suggested. Keep that in mind as we move further down this list, because from here on, canned goods start showing up a lot more often. Number 14. Fried chicken livers. Sold for a fraction of the cost of any other cut, chicken livers were dredged in seasoned flour and fried hard and fast until the outside turned deeply crisp while the inside stayed rich and tender. A single pound could feed several people once served over rice with a little pan gravy, stretching a genuinely inexpensive cut of meat into a dinner that felt far more substantial than its actual cost. Some households served them alongside grits for breakfast instead, turning the same cheap ingredient into 2 entirely different meals across a single week. A quick soak in buttermilk before the flour went on was the small trick that separated a truly tender liver from a tough one, and most mothers who made this dish regularly swore by it without ever writing the step down anywhere. Number 13. Canned mackerel and grits. A can of mackerel, flaked apart and warmed with a little onion and pepper, served over a bowl of hot buttered grits. Canned mackerel cost far less than fresh fish and sat on a pantry shelf for months without spoiling, which made it a dependable stand-in whenever fresh fish wasn't available or affordable. It carried a stronger, oilier flavor than canned salmon, and families who grew up on it often preferred it specifically for that reason, long after other options became easier to find. A can cost only a fraction of what fresh fish ran at the counter, and it needed nothing more than a hot pan and a few minutes to turn into a full meal. Number 12. Deviled ham sandwiches. Canned deviled ham, spread straight from its small paper-wrapped tin onto a slice of white bread, sometimes mixed with a little mayonnaise to stretch it further. This was one of the defining convenience foods of the entire decade, sold in nearly every grocery store in the country, and prized specifically because it required no cooking and no refrigeration until the can was actually opened. Packed into a lunch pail or a school sack, it gave a mother one less thing to think about on a morning when there simply wasn't time for anything more complicated. The little can, wrapped in plain paper with a small red devil printed on the label, became such a familiar sight in school lunches that some kids nicknamed it after the shoe polish tins it happened to resemble. Number 11. Pigtails and rice. Pigtails, simmered low and slow for hours with onion, vinegar, and a heavy hand of black pepper until the meat turned tender enough to fall away from the bone, served spooned over rice along with the rich, fatty broth left behind. Like so many of the cheapest cuts on this list, pigtails came from a part of the animal most butchers sold at rock-bottom prices, which made them a genuine bargain for a family willing to put in the hours of slow cooking they required. The broth alone, poured over a bowl of plain rice, was often considered just as valuable as the meat itself. It wasn't a quick dish by any measure, but a Sunday afternoon with nowhere else to be gave a mother exactly the kind of time this particular cut needed to turn from tough and fatty into something genuinely worth serving. Number 10. Chicken bone soup. After a chicken had already been roasted or fried and every last scrap of meat picked from the bones, the carcass went straight into a pot with water, onion, celery, and whatever vegetables were left in the icebox simmered for hours into a simple, warming soup. Nothing about this dish required a trip to the store at all. It existed purely to make sure a single chicken fed a family twice, once as a main dish and once again as a soup a day or two later. Some mothers added a handful of rice or noodles to stretch it even further into a second full dinner. This was the dish that made a single roasted chicken feel like two entirely separate meals, and plenty of families never even considered throwing out a carcass, since everyone understood it still had one more supper left in it. Number 9. Tomato gravy and biscuits. Canned or fresh tomatoes, simmered down with a little flour, bacon drippings, sugar, and black pepper until thick enough to spoon generously over a split, hot biscuit. This dish leaned on ingredients nearly every kitchen already had on hand, requiring no trip to the butcher counter at all, which made it a genuine fallback on the nights closest to the end of the grocery budget. The sugar wasn't there to make it sweet. It was there to cut the sharp acidity of the tomatoes, a small trick most families learned by trial rather than any written recipe. Poured hot over a split biscuit straight out of the oven, it turned two of the plainest ingredients in the whole kitchen into a breakfast that felt like it had taken far more effort than it actually had. Number 8. Chow mein noodle casserole. A product of the decade's growing fascination with canned convenience, this casserole combined canned chow mein noodles, a can of cream soup, chopped celery, and whatever leftover chicken or ground beef was on hand, baked until the top turned crisp and golden. It represented a genuinely new kind of dish for Black households in the 1960s. Not a recipe passed down from a grandmother, but one pulled straight off the back of a soup, can label and adapt it into a family's weekly rotation. It was cheap, it was fast, and it fed a crowd using almost entirely shelf-stable ingredients. Neighbors traded these kinds of recipes back and forth over the phone or across a backyard fence, which meant a single good casserole idea could spread through an entire block within a matter of weeks. Now, before we finish out the list, it's worth naming something plainly. A lot of what's left here didn't come from a garden or a smokehouse at all. It came from a can, a box, or a jar, because the 1960s kitchen simply looked different than the kitchen a generation earlier. That shift wasn't a loss of tradition so much as an adaptation to it. A mother working a full shift outside the home still had to get dinner on the table by 6, and a shelf of canned goods let her do that without sacrificing an evening she didn't have to spare. It wasn't a betrayal of anybody's grandmother's cooking. It was that same resourcefulness her grandmother had, aimed at a completely different set of tools. Keep that in mind as we close out this list. Number 7. Canned corned beef hash and eggs. A can of corned beef hash, fried hard in a skillet until the edges turned crisp and dark, served alongside a couple of fried or scrambled eggs. This was one of the single most popular canned dinners of the entire decade, prized because it required no prep work beyond opening the can and turning on the stove. A single can, split between a few plates alongside eggs and toast, could cover breakfast or dinner for an entire family on a night when there simply wasn't time or energy for anything more involved. Fried hard enough, the edges of the hash turned almost as crisp as home fries, which was usually enough to convince a skeptical kid it counted as a real cooked meal instead of something poured straight from a can. Number 6. Smothered chicken and rice. Chicken pieces, seared until golden, then simmered low and slow under a thick blanket of onion gravy until they turned fork tender, served spooned generously over plain white rice. A single cut-up chicken, smothered down this way, could feed a much larger family than the same chicken fried or roasted plain, because the gravy itself became a second course spooned right over the rice. It was a Sunday dinner staple in households where a whole roasted bird simply wasn't in the week's budget. Leftover gravy from the pot rarely went to waste either, usually saved for the next morning's biscuits, so not a single spoonful of it went down the drain. Number 5. Oxtail stew. Oxtails, browned, and then simmered for hours with onion, carrot, and a little tomato until the meat turned deeply tender and the broth thickened into a rich, dark gravy on its own. In the 1960s, oxtail was considered a genuinely cheap, overlooked cut, sold at a fraction of the price it commands today, which made this slow-cooked stew an affordable way to put real, substantial meat on the table for very little money. It's one of the clearest examples on this entire list of a dish that started as a budget necessity and later became something people sought out on purpose. The long cook time meant a mother needed the better part of an afternoon to do it right, but the payoff was a rich, gelatinous broth that most families considered worth every one of those hours. Number 4. Hamburger rice skillet. Ground beef, browned and broken apart in a skillet, mixed with rice, canned tomatoes, and onion, then simmered together until the rice absorbed the liquid and the whole dish turned into one thick, hearty one-pot dinner. A single pound of ground beef, stretched with a full cup of rice, could genuinely feed a family of 6 or more, turning a modest amount of meat into a dish that felt like it belonged on a much bigger budget. It cleaned up easily, too, which mattered on a night when there wasn't time for a sink full of dishes. Some households threw in a can of kidney beans or a diced bell pepper if there was one to spare, quietly turning the exact same base dish into something that felt a little different depending on the week. Number 3. Fried whiting fish. Whiting was, and still is, one of the most affordable fish sold at any southern fish counter, dredged in cornmeal and fried hard and fast until the outside turned deeply crisp. A few dollars worth of whiting could feed an entire family, served alongside rice or grits and a wedge of cornbread, making it one of the most dependable Friday night dinners in households across the country. Its mild flavor made it an easy sell, even to children who turned their noses up at stronger, oilier fish. Fish fries built entirely around whiting became a small neighborhood tradition in plenty of towns, sold out of a home kitchen window on a Friday night to anyone who didn't feel like cooking that particular week. Number 2. Creamed chipped beef on toast. Thin, salty dried beef, torn into small pieces and stirred into a simple white sauce made from butter, flour, and milk, spooned generously over hot toast. Sometimes called by a much blunter nickname in military households, this dish made its way into plenty of civilian kitchens throughout the 1960s because dried beef was cheap, shelf-stable, and required almost no preparation beyond tearing it apart with your hands. A single small jar could stretch across an entire family's breakfast or dinner, served over toast that used up bread that was a day or two past its best. It was salty enough that a little went a long way, which made it one of the more genuinely economical dishes on this entire list, despite how rich and satisfying it tasted once it hit the plate. And number 1, not a dish anyone would call special, and not something that ever needed a written recipe at all. Biscuits and milk gravy. Warm, freshly baked biscuits split open and covered generously with a simple gravy made from flour, bacon drippings, and milk, seasoned with nothing more than salt and a heavy crack of black pepper. No meat was required at all, just fat, flour, and milk, 3 ingredients nearly every kitchen in the country already had on hand at any given moment. This dish showed up on more black family tables in the 1960s than almost anything else on this entire list, not because it was anyone's favorite, but because it was the one meal a mother could always make, regardless of what the icebox held or how far into the month the grocery money had already stretched. I put it at number 1 for exactly that reason. The plainest dish on this whole list, and the one that never once failed a single family that needed it. It didn't need a special occasion, a full pantry, or a trip to the store. It only needed a mother, a hot stove, and whatever few minutes she could spare before everybody sat down. So tell me, which of these did your mother actually cook, and which one do you still find yourself craving out of nowhere? I read every comment, and half of what ends up in this journal comes straight from families who lived through every single one of these dinners. If this kind of history matters to you, do something small about it. Like this video, subscribe to the journal, and I'll keep pulling these recipes up out of kitchens the history books never bothered to write about. Because every dish on this list says the same true thing. A mother working with very little never once treated her family like they had very little. She fed them like it was everything she had to give. Because most nights, it was. If any of these 20 are still showing up on a stove somewhere in your family today, that's not just a recipe surviving. That's a decade of quiet resourcefulness still doing exactly what it was built to do.